In the Gita, 2nd chapter, 64, the man of perfect self-control is able to act in this world unaffected by it. Inwardly, free from attraction and repulsion, he has attained unshakable inner calmness. Now, if you're in a rowboat on a high sea, of course you're going to be constantly tossed up and down, probably becoming seasick. It'll be very difficult to think clearly. And in this world, where people are constantly battered by likes and dislikes, their emotions are so involved, their fears, their actions, their repulsions, their attractions. All these things keep them constantly in a state of confusion. If you want to function well, even in this world, then the best thing is to function in the state of God. It isn't as if this were an either-or thing. Either you succeed in the world or you succeed in God. You succeed in the world in a worldly way if you have this calm non-attachment to attraction and repulsion. So Jesus is saying that once he has attained unshakable inner calmness, he is unaffected by anything. And he says in the next stanza, with the attainment of soul bliss, every vestige of sorrow disappears. Bliss gives perfect discrimination and soon establishes one's consciousness firmly in the self. So, the sorrows of this world are really man-made. They're in the mind. And when we can remain completely calm, you see, duality has always got its opposites. I remember a very funny story. Many years ago, I wanted to buy a dictation machine. I was in New York, and I got this dictation machine, and the man who sold it to me recorded into it, and it was working so fine. And I put it in my pocket. Well, that evening I went to Carnegie Hall, to the Metropolitan something or other, I forget now. Anyway, it was a concert hall where Raphael Kubelik was the conductor. And they were playing Smetana's Moldau, when I suddenly thought, well, I wonder if this thing, although it's a dictation machine, I wonder if it will record at a distance. Well, recording at these concerts is absolutely forbidden. And so I thought, well, after all, I'm not doing anything to threaten anybody. I'm just to see if my dictation machine will work at a distance. So I pushed the button, and I pushed the wrong button. And instead of recording, it's played what was already recorded. Hello, testing, 1, 2. I got all the way to 4 before I could finally discover that button that would turn that off. And the conductor whirled around like this, and it was a big scene, and I was very embarrassed. But you know, the interesting thing was that in the midst of my embarrassment, I couldn't help thinking, what a good story this will be to tell. And so you find that in duality, there are always two sides. There was this intense embarrassment, but it was a very good story. And whenever you feel great pain and so on, there's always a certain pleasure. Isn't it interesting how after a war, so many novels come out? Everybody hates the war. Why do they like to write novels and read novels about the war? So there's always something that is attractive even in the horrible things of life. People like to talk about the operation they had years ago, and they're still talking about it. One time a woman came to Yogananda and was saying to him, telling about the harrowing experiences she'd had with this operation. And finally he said, well, my goodness, when did you have this thing? Oh, 20 years ago. People somehow, there's a pleasure in pain, and there's a suffering even in sorrow. That song in Spanish, Bésame mucho, como si fuera esta noche la última vez. Kiss me as if this were the last time. The idea is that even in the pleasure of love and so on, there's always the fear of losing it, the fear of pain, the fear of suffering. And in all joy there is a certain pain. In all pain there is a certain joy. The two are not only oppositional states, they're right there. In the midst of the pain, there is pleasure. In the midst of the pleasure, there is pain. And so this goes on endlessly. The play of duality is both dual and real on each side. The suffering is joy, the joy is suffering. It's an endless thing. And you'll never get out from this whirlpool of confusion until you attain that perfect self-control. When you're inwardly free from attraction and repulsion, then you find that everything disappears, sorrow disappears. And then the thing is that in that, it's strange, but you think that in that state you wouldn't have either joy or sorrow, but you do have bliss. Bliss is that state to which there is no opposite. And when your mind is when your mind is completely calm, then you have that bliss. And so Krishna says, those with unsettled consciousness have no discrimination. Those who are unmeditative cannot know peace. And for those who lack peace, how is happiness possible? Peace is the foundation of happiness. If you have no peace, you cannot be happy. This is a very important principle to understand, that the condition for happiness is inner peace. As a boat moving on water may be swept off its course by a gale, so discrimination may be swept from its path by the vagaries of sensory influence. And so you must always be even-minded, and when the waves go up and down, just don't be touched. I remember one time I was in the Green Island off the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and it was the island was very nice, and I decided I'd like to stay the night there. And I had lectures to give in Cairns, and so I had to come back the next day whether I liked it or not. But the next day it was a very unsettled sea, and I had been subject to seasickness as a child, and I was a little worried because I didn't want to come in like a limp towel to that lecture that I was to give. So I said, well, let me do something I haven't thought of before. I will greet this, I will want to have the waves go up and down, I will greet them with joy. And so every time the boat pitched up and down, I would say, yes, yes, good, wonderful. And you know, although I arrived somewhat limp in my willpower, I didn't have any seasickness. In fact, I've never had it since then. An interesting point to keep in mind. When you're inwardly, when you can embrace the difficulties of life, when you say yes and affirm it positively, you can go beyond the likes and dislikes. Don't be afraid, don't withdraw. This is your reactive process which creates you constantly moving and up and down on the waves of life. Therefore, O mighty armed Arjuna, withdraw your sense faculties. The power to see, hear, etc., from the senses themselves and from sense objects. Thus will your wisdom become firmly established. So, in a sense, by embracing it, since I couldn't withdraw from it, I too found that it no longer touched me. So, in both ways you can do it. By accepting duality and going with it and then withdrawing from it that way, or just withdrawing your senses. And this is the easiest and best way of all, but not one I was able to do on that high sea. That which is right for the unenlightened, that which is night for the unenlightened, is day for the yogi. And that which is day for ordinary people is night for the yogi seer, who perceives the inner reality. Now this is because usually yogis will meditate late at night when there's no disturbance. I remember living in San Francisco. I lived there for 5 years in California, and I lived enough away from the main traffic not to be disturbed by it. But I noticed that at 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a definite increase of peace. It wasn't a decrease of sound. It was an increase of peace because everybody was sleeping then. And so if you can get your consciousness into that place where you are no longer touched by the outward movements of mind and consciousness and so on, then you have that peace. So that which is night for the yogi, I meditated best at that time, because then I was able to be peaceful and not disturbed. Whereas in that which is night for the worldly person is day for the yogi for that reason. And that which is day for the yogi is night for the worldly people. So this ties in also with the thought of when people are asleep is the best time to meditate. When they are active, that's the best time for you to sleep. But of course there's a deeper meaning to that too. That when the minds of people are disturbed, don't be with them. Be apart. Don't mix with people who are restless. Mix with calm people. And you will find that then it is easier to meditate. Contentment is his who, like the ocean, calmly absorbs into himself all the rivers of desire. One, on the contrary, whose desires trickle outward as if from a pond, is soon drained of energy. So this is the important thing, to become like a capacious ocean which absorbs all the tributary rivers into it. Whereas if you allow yourself to be taken by those rivers in many different directions, you yourself will be confused, and your desires will trickle outward, and you won't have any energy left to do anything worthwhile. That person knows peace who, relinquishing all energy-draining desires and fully satisfied with his state of desirelessness, no longer sees himself as a separate individual ego. So it's your desires, of course, that make you think of yourself as separate. I want this, I don't want that. It makes you think I'm the person, the subject. These teachings in the Gita are so absolutely wonderful. And every sloka has some deep meaning. And in some ways I feel I'm almost cheating you and myself too by going quickly. But after all, there are 700 slokas. But this truth, remember, the more you are inwardly calm, the more nothing will be able to touch you. That person knows truth who, relinquishing all energy-draining desires and fully satisfied with his state of desirelessness, no longer sees himself as a separate individual ego, as we've read before. O Partha, Arjuna, this state is known as Brahmisthiti, absolute oneness with the infinite. Anyone who achieves this state will never again fall into delusion. Even at the moment of death, and this is very important, and this is why I've talked about the importance of that final exam, that if you can leave your body at death without any feeling of attachment, then you go into infinite consciousness. Even at the moment of death, if one concentrates wholeheartedly on this state, he attains perfect eternal bliss. And so Krishna says again and again, that moment of death is very important. If you think of the devatas, you will go to them. If you think of the ancestors, you will go to them. If you think of me, you will come to me. And so we come now to chapter 3. 1. Arjuna said, O Janardana, Krishna, the divine liberator, if, as it seems, you consider understanding superior to action, why, O Keshava, have you been arguing and urging me into this terrible action? And Krishna explains it then. But you see, the path of truth, as Krishna goes on to say, let me read that too. First of all, Arjuna says, this apparent contradiction confuses me. Please tell me clearly which path will help me toward the highest good. My guru used to say that you have to be intensely active for God before you can attain that actionless state. It will not come to people who just sit in caves and meditate. They won't get there. You have to be active. You have to not only act, but learn how to give all your actions to God. When you can do that, then you can attain moksha. So the Cosmic Lord said, O sinless one, at the beginning of creation I established two means by which man could achieve salvation. The first was by wisdom, the other by right action. Actionlessness cannot be attained by mere inaction. You can't enact anyway, you can't not act. You have to breathe, you have to eat, you have to, even your heart pumping is an action. One who forsakes work in the name of divine aloofness from activity cannot reach perfection. And so he's saying wisdom is necessary, but to attain that wisdom, first you must do action for God's sake. Give your actions to God. Give the fruits of your action for God. You have to act, but you have to act in a divine way. This is a very important truth because so many people think that if they just go off and meditate, they will find God. And usually that happens is the mind is constantly restless. When you learn to give your heart, give your mind, give your actions to God, gradually all your energy goes in that direction and it pulls everything else like a tugboat in its wake. And then you can achieve that state. So wisdom will come primarily through right action. And those who are born with that wisdom, then even they usually act in order not to give a wrong example to their disciples. A liberated soul doesn't need to meditate, doesn't need to act, doesn't need to meditate either. But he acts in order to show his disciples that path which will lead to liberation. This is the path my Guru taught me, and it will lead you also to what you're seeking in life. Joy to you.